Guest tonight that's really a world-famous storyteller in his own right, but he's also famous. He's been in Unalaska, I think, almost 40 years? Getting there, close to 40 years. And he is, well, I'm going to let him say, can you introduce yourself too? Okay. But this is Dan Magone from Resolve Magone Marine, and he's going to be our guest storyteller speaker tonight to talk to you about his experiences in the Aleutian Islands. Let's give him a round of applause.
Okay, you got to get both mics though to get, this is channel 8, so you got to sort of to do both at the same time.
Okay, so how much time are we talking?
You got a half hour.
Okay, all right.
At least.
We're giving him a half hour. We know you guys got to come and go. That's okay. You get more food, that's fine. Get up. He's going to just keep rolling.
Okay, good evening, everybody. You hear me okay? All right, so at any rate, I've got a good story that I thought of, came to mind when I saw Chris Woodley. Is Chris around here anywhere? Ex-Coast Guard guy is working with the trawlers now. At any rate, when I saw Chris today, it reminded me of a story with that had to do with the Selendang Ayu. That particular incident, as you're all aware of, was a big deal, and there's quite a few stories, just in what I was involved in, and likewise, there's other people that've got their own stories on that thing. But there's one story in particular that Chris reminded me of that was kind of apropos for all of you folks that are here. I don't think we have anybody here that represents the big pollution response organizations, so it's okay if we roast them a little bit. Okay, so at any rate, if maybe Chris will show up, but if you see him, you can, elbow him that I brought him into this story. But anyway, so what the background here is the Selendang went aground, and I was there in a helicopter, in a private helicopter that I hired, to go assess the situation so I could report back to the incident command, what we were going to be faced with the next day. And so, I came back, and of course then the Coast Guard helicopter crashed, and all these things happened, and there was nothing else that we could do with the Redeemer that was over there. So I, through Chris Woodley, asked the captain of the port if we could be relieved and come back to Dutch and gear up for pollution. And so we got the boat back in town, and we loaded it with every bit of gear we could find, all the boom and oil snare and, super sacks and everything you need for heavy oil recovery. But mostly boom. We've got every bit of containment boom we could round up, and not only loaded our old salvage tug, the Redeemer, but also our little landing craft, the Joshua. And we had a lull right after the storm that put the Selendang aground, and so we wanted to take advantage of that lull and get into Magone Bay as quickly as we could. So we got over there, and then the following day, and went to work doing protective booming of all the streams and that kind of stuff. And then of course the weather came up, and so nobody could really, get crews over there or anything else. It was just our two boats to start with, and so eventually the big incident response company that was represented, the RP, showed up, and they're trying to get their response plan all geared up and everything. And so we get out there and start booming, and the guys get all of the creeks and all the little estuaries boomed off in Magone Bay, and they got one last creek that they boom off, and then they give me a call on the phone that okay, we got the boom across the creek, and we see the oil's coming down the shore. What do we do now? And I says, well, you got any boom left? And they go, yeah, we got one more, 200 or 300 feet of boom. And I says, okay, well, let's get that anchored to shore and run it out at an angle, and we're going to start collecting oil. So we got that we got that boom out there and the oil snares, and so the guys are out there making a big old mess and filling the super sacks full of this stuff, and so the next day, here comes the Redeemer back to town with a full load of all this heavy oil, and so the response contractor, he comes over to me in the incident command there, and he slams down this big book in front of me, that's about 3 inches thick, and he says, I want you, he says, have you read this? And I go, well, I read part of it. I got as far as the part that talks about snake bites, and then I kind of lost it, And he goes, well, anywhere in here does it say that you're supposed to be cleaning up oil? And I go, well, actually, I didn't get to that part, but I just kind of assumed that that's what we're supposed to be doing. And he goes, nowhere in here does it say you're supposed to be cleaning up oil? And I go, yeah, okay, fine. So anyway, because they weren't ready for it yet. So, all right. So we weren't getting along right off the bat, And they were calling us cowboys and stuff, and because we didn't even have a contract. Nobody had hired us. We were just out there doing it, So anyway, then in the days that followed, a bunch of boats got out there, and now there's a whole fleet of them. And my brother Dave calls me, the captain on the Redeemer. He calls me and says, hey, Dan, he says, we just got orders for tomorrow, and we're supposed to go over to the west end of the island and do protective booming. Well, everybody knows the oil went the opposite direction. It went into Magone Bay, right? And so it's like, obviously, they were just trying to get rid of the fleet. And so I go to Chris Woodley here at the, actually not in the command center because I wanted to be more discreet. I found him at dinner over there at Ziggy's, or actually, no, it's Amelia's now. But at any rate, so I find Chris over there, and I go, Chris, I says, this is strange. They're telling us to run away from the oil. And he goes, well, I'll call the captain. So he calls the captain to port. So the captain of port tells Chris and I that we're supposed to go to the operations briefing the next morning. Well, I wasn't too comfortable with that because, we weren't buddies, and they didn't want us they didn't want me in the operations briefing room, but by orders of the captain of the port. So I go there with Chris, and it's just completely packed, and they got a big table, and there's one place to sit. Chris got a space to sit down, and I stood by the window and watched the birds out in Margaret's Bay there, from this very building. So anyway, there's a real professional guy on the whiteboard there, and so he starts off, and he's got a list of the boats, and he's got all the sectors. They've divided off the whole area into sections, and so he starts, saying, okay, this boat's headed to whatever section, and we'll be doing protective booming. And he goes all the way down through the whole thing, and he gets to the end, and so Chris goes, excuse me, he says, who's going to be cleaning up oil? And so the guy turns to Chris, and he says, well, we're not cleaning up oil. He says, we have to get all of our scat teams to do all their work first before we can clean up any oil. He says, it might take 3 weeks or more. And one of the guys at the table says, oh, it's going to take more than that. It's going to be 6 weeks. And so Chris is kind of alarmed. He goes, well, the captain of the port's not going to want to hear that. We need to be cleaning up oil. And so it turned into a big bunch of murmuring because everybody's telling Chris that, all these reasons why that they have to do all this work before we can do any cleanup. And since there's only one helicopter they're going to let them use, it's going to take them months to get all this done, right? And so Chris is saying, well, the captain's not going to want to hear that. And so they're all kind of shouting him down. And so I turned around from the window, and I said, excuse me, can I get everybody's attention? And so I did. And so I said, there's only one reason why we're here, and that's to keep you all from getting tarred and feathered if the community finds out what you're planning to do. And so then I had to kind of run. And so I escaped, but I was not anybody's best friend. And so then we got orders from the captain of the port that Chris and I are supposed to go back again the next morning. And I'm going, oh, no, I don't want to go. But I did. And it would clear it out. It's only half of the folks are there anymore. And And so there's lots of places to sit down. And so here's the same professional guy gets up there and on the whiteboard, and he starts with the first boat, and he says, okay, this boat's going to be going to whatever sector, and they're going to be doing oil cleanup operations. And he goes to the second boat, and he says, they're going to this sector doing oil cleanup. And the third boat, and this one guy stands up and he goes, but we haven't done this and that yet. And then the same professional gentleman turns to him and goes, by order of the captain of the port, we're going to be doing this. And he just continues on down the list. And so, I say that, it's kind of funny in a way. In some ways, there's nothing funny about any of the jobs that we get involved with, but sometimes you have to see the humor in it. But at any rate, it's an important story that shows that community involvement's really, really important. And it really it can make a big difference in those kind of situations. So at any rate, so yeah, that's the story that Chris reminded me of. So anyways, I'm all full of stories. I love a good story. So does anybody have a favorite one that they think of that the folks would want to hear tonight, or should I just pick one? And if anybody wants to comment on anything too, that's fine. You want an oldie moldy, or the old ones are kind of good because I don't have to worry about the political ramifications. Some of the newer ones are going to get me in trouble. Yeah, he was the star of the show. They filmed that job, and yeah, that was a miserable job for me. Craig did a good job of it, on the film, but they didn't like me because I was grumpy all the time. But that wasn't particularly notable. There was a lot of fuel. I think we got over 50,000 gallons of fuel off of that thing, and we had to pump it into bladders up on the beach and put a electric fence around it to keep the bears from chewing up the bladders. And we had bears tearing up tents and stuff and tearing the seats out of our equipment, and it was, but anyway, let's see, what would be okay, well, here's another one that's kind of involves, that's interesting in terms of the agencies and stuff. And that was the one with the Cougar Ace. Okay, most of you are probably familiar with that. That was a big car carrier that rolled over a couple 100 miles south of Atka. And so Titan was, let's see, was it Titan? Yeah, Titan was the part of the response organization there. And so they hired us because we had boats. So we went out there with the Redeemer in the McCushin Bay and boarded it and did our inspections and this and that. We had a tragedy the first day we were on board with a naval architect fell. But at any rate, we determined that the thing was relatively stable, and so this fellow, Rich Abib, was the salvage master for Titan, and he wanted us to try to get that thing rolled right side up out there, and I wasn't too much of a fan of the idea because it was so difficult to do anything offshore, and so I told him, well, let's try and get it in behind the islands at least, or get it into protective waters, a port of refuge type of thing. And I remember Rich telling me, he says, if I was in charge of Alaska, I wouldn't let us bring this thing in. And I go, well, look, it's a day-by-day thing here. We're figuring out what the status is of this ship, and as we get more and more comfortable with it, then we can share that comfort level with the agencies and the Coast Guard, and you know, if we can show them that we've got something safe to bring in, then I think we can do it, you know. And, you know, and I've had my issues. I've had my issues in the past, you know. I mean, there was a Lieutenant Woodall here in charge of the Marine Safety Detachment one year that was going to go with me. We had a Canadian tug bring in an old tanker and a cruise ship out of Canadian waters. They were taking it to scrap in China or somewhere. Anyway, they said they needed to get this cruise ship into town to stabilize it, and so I needed a job, of course. So my thing was to get Chris or get Mr. Woodall out there and convince him that this thing was safe to bring into town. Of course, we get out there, and the doggone thing is taking on water too fast, and you know, that's a whole nother funny story. But anyway, the doggone thing sinks right in front of us, right out in front of Yelacta Head out here, and so, you know, that one I couldn't quite get into port. But so some of them don't work out so well. But at any rate, this one here, I thought, you know, we could get it in and we could save it, you know, but we would have to work with all the agencies and get not only, you know, cooperation, but people that be willing to trust what we had to report to them. And so, you know, we've seen, I can't remember right tonight, what was the name of that ship that there was a tanker that broke up and sank off the coast of Spain a couple of years before that. And it was a situation where they could have got it into a port of refuge, but nobody would let it into a port, so it stayed out there in the weather, and that thing breaks in half, spills, you know, a couple million gallons of fuel, and that gets all over the beaches everywhere. And that was an example of the opposite, see? So my experience in Alaska is, you know, we've got agency folks up here that, you know, see the big picture and are willing to work together as long as we've got a responsible plan. And so we all move forward. Well, I still had my own separate company, Magone Marine Service. So it was Magone Marine, and it was Titan, and we had Foss involved in Crowley. So there was 4 different American Salvage Association companies working together on that one project. And so we ended up getting that thing, you know, first they said you could bring it in within 100 miles of the islands. And so then we got within 100 miles of the islands, and we couldn't do much more of it than that. And so then it was like, okay, you know, all right, go ahead. You can bring it in. You can get it into the lee of Unalaska Island. Well, we got into the lee of Unalaska Island, and it was too dangerous. We just couldn't do it out there in open water, even in the summertime. And so then we convinced them, okay, that we could bring it into Unalaska Bay, and we brought it in. We anchored it up over in Wide Bay with a bunch of big anchors, and we were able to ride it, and it had a good ending. So it was just an example of everybody working together and how we can get it done here in Alaska. You know, I think probably when I think of the highlight of that whole story, I think there was like 5,500 Mazdas on that ship, or thereabouts, right? So one of my tasks, I was in charge of the team that was supposed to pump the wedge of water off the number 9 deck. And so here I am down there, we're on, you know, with technical climbing gear. Of course, the thing's tipped over on its side. So I'm down there hanging like a spider down at the lower end. Above the water, there was the row of cars on the bottom there was mostly covered with water, and I'm trying to get a pump suction in there. I got a big Wilden pump sitting on a big frame there, and I'm trying to get this stiff pump suction in the water, but I'm just spinning around because I'm hanging from this line that goes, you know, 80 feet up into the overhead. So I'm trying to get a foot on a windshield or something, and I finally get a footing, and I managed to get the pump suction in the water, and, you know, okay, you know, make it hot, you know, they turn the air on, and so this thing starts pumping the water out, and once the water gets in the pipe, then it stabilizes, and I don't have to hold it anymore. So I let go of the hose, and I turned around and looked up, and here's, if you can imagine, there's 15 rows of cars, so it'd be like a 15-lane freeway, right? All hanging over the top. Every one of them's hanging from 2 nylon straps that are about 1 inch wide, right? and it was quite a sight looking up there. I thought, you don't see this view very often. So I'll never forget that. But at any rate, you know, that was a really good example of everybody pitching together and making something happen, you know, the way we do here in Alaska. So does that remind anybody of a story that you've heard or want to rehear or anything?
Hey, Dad, how many rats did you take off rat boat? They were going on it, weren't they?
I think we got 20 altogether. I should have had them taxidermied, but yeah. But that really wasn't the rat boat. You know, no, the Chilbosan was the rat boat. The Chilbosan was, this one that he's talking about is this illegal fishing boat that got towed into Alaska waters. And what was the name of that one? The Magone Perkasa, some Indonesian rig or something. Yeah, Magone Perkasa was the name of it. Right. Yeah, I think that I got a kick out of it though with, you know, maintain my reputation with the Coast Guard, right? So they've got the thing in McCushion Bay Beaver Inlet. So we met them over in Beaver Inlet, right? And so we pull up with a Western Viking, right? So we pull alongside of the Western Viking, and myself and my son hopped on board, and I've got my black float coat on, you know, safety black, and so I go on board and, you know, find the lieutenant in charge, and I say, okay, well, I need to get all the Coast Guard personnel up forward, and then I opened my jacket and showed him I've got my Colt Python 357 Magnum with a 6-inch barrel, and I go, yeah, we may be discharging firearms, you know, and so it was pretty cute, you know. So he gets on the radio, calls the cutter, oh, the Magone crew's on here, and they're armed. That was fun, but. At any rate, yeah, that wasn't really, it was some rats, you know, and it's its own story, but the Chilbosan now, that one wrecked over there on the other side of Scan Bay, and that one, that was a Korean boat quite a while back, and that thing got bad infested with rats, and after it was abandoned, the rats multiplied like crazy. When we went over there to do the fuel removals on it, we brought a case of rat poison, and we opened it up, and we took out one of the boxes of rat poison. We opened the box of rat poison and took the little packs out, and we opened the packs up and put them in the hallway, right? So we came back that afternoon, and all the little packs were all empty. And so then we came back that evening, and all the empty packs were gone, and the case had been gotten into, and all the poison was eaten out of all the packs, and half the packs and half the cardboard box the case was made out of was eaten. And so that was the rat boat there. That one was so creepy that my brother Craig wouldn't sleep on board. You know, that one there, that was the one where there was a rat on a pipe over. Scott Smith was the engineer we had then, and he's doing this haywire wiring where we ran cables up from our little salvage boat up to run into the mast house to power up the motors to run the yard arms for the ship so that we could use the yard arms to unload all the barrel product. And so they're up there doing this wiring, and this rat's on a pipe right over the top of Scott, and Craig whacks it with a crescent wrench, and the rat jumped, and all he did was cut the tail off, but the tail went down Scott's neck, right? Oh, he was creeped out. Just was sure Craig did that on purpose. But anyway, yeah, that was a rat boat there. So let's see, what else? What's another? No, I didn't. I had to catch them with traps. They were too sneaky. It was just you know, it was just, you know, salesmanship, you know. You got to maintain maintain the myth, you know. That's right. Yeah, the big problem we had on that job was, you know, for years I had a state license for controlled use pesticides, and so I think for 12 years I'd had it. Well, in the middle of that project, somebody in the state there, somebody at Department of Commerce or whatever, they looked up the file and they found out that my pesticide license had expired, had lapsed three weeks previously. So I'm out there killing rats illegally, right? And so it created this big problem with the Coast Guard. And it's a funny story, but it's kind of tough to deal with all these regulations anymore.
Well, that's a potential business line now, because I think the refuge is going to get out of it too.
Oh yeah, it was through the refuge that we always got our licenses renewed. Yeah.
I think they're going to get out of the business. So who's going to be our stop rats? You
Yeah.
and your
Well, we used to have a kit, you know, that U.S. Fish and Wildlife provided us with, and it included a 410 shotgun for years, and then finally they had to come take the shotgun out because they weren't allowed to disperse firearms anymore. Okay.
Hey guys, we're really excited about you all being here tonight, and it took us a little while to get everybody settled and the ticket stuff and everything, but we even have new people showing up as we speak, like just getting off the plane, so we're going to have a great conclusion to the forum. I just want to say about this man, Dan Magone, real quick. When he kind of underplays himself in a lot of ways. When we had the Hiroshima oil spill, he was one of the first responders, and it was on a night when it was one of the worst type of weathers that we have here. Blowing snow, blowing 50, 60, 2-3 feet of snow. I don't even know how they got out on the road that night. But he sent his team out to the ship from the shore. You didn't talk about this, did you? You guys want to hear that story? Okay. We're going to have a special raffle here in about 20 minutes. So everybody, those blue raffle tickets you had, we're going to be raffling off a Nez Perce blanket that was signed by the artist from Lewiston, Idaho. And I'm going to show it here in a little bit. Actually, Dan, let's show it, you and me. Let's pull this thing out. It's got two sides to it. It's a Pendleton woolen blanket, and it was purchased by the tribe for the conference, and we wanted to really give back to all the partners that we have. And let's show the other side. Both sides are significant culturally. And right here, it's signed by the artist. It says Aleutian Life Forum, Kevin Peters, signed. So we're going to give that away in a little bit. So save your raffle tickets. So Dan, let's hear that story about the Hiroshima that night.
All right, here we go. So what happened with the Hiroshima is they were anchored up over in Summer Bay, and we had some weather out of the north, and it was building, but they thought that they could ride it out with an anchor. They got to pay pilots to move the boat, so they didn't want to move it if they didn't have to. But then the weather got worse and worse, and I remember at lunchtime I told my kids that that ship was in danger because they'd waited so long, and now they've got this onshore wind and a big swell. And so the captain had to make a decision here before long what he was going to do. And so I left it at that. And so a couple hours later, I got the call from the Alaska Maritime Agency that, that the ship was aground and whatever it is that you do, do it, And so I told the crew to gear up. One of my guys, John Whitekettle, and I put a small inflatable. We stuffed it in the back of the Suburban to where 2/3 of it hung out of the truck, and we headed off out to Summer Bay Road. And we launched the inflatable in the surf and paddled out there, but they had the Jacob's ladder back aft. And so we had like 20-foot seas or bigger that were slamming into the ship. The ship, what had happened is, as they tried to pick anchor, a big wave came over the bow, and the chief mate and the first mate were killed outright, and the third mate was badly injured, and so by wave while they were trying to work the anchor gear, and so they managed to get the anchor gear up, but before that they could get behind Yalakta Head because they had no cargo on board. They were real light, and the wind pushed them onto the rocks just by Eagle Rock there, where when you get to Summer Bay. And so he backed off the rocks, and the wind blew him onto the sand on the inside of Summer Bay there in front of the sand dunes, in front of the lake. So when we got there, we got in the dinghy and paddled through the surf and got over to the Jacob's ladder, and we couldn't. So John has this Jacob's ladder, and I got the oars. He's up in the bow there, and we're fixing to get tied off to the thing, and then all of a sudden he's holding on to it, and the suction from the when the waves would hit, they'd wrap around the bow and the stern, and then they'd draw back out again, and so that put a big load on. There's all this suction trying to pull us down underneath the stern of the ship where the propeller and everything is, and about 30 feet of slack in the Jacob's ladder came over the rail because they didn't have it secured well, and so that was almost the end of us, because now we're just like right there, right above where the water is just churning as it sucks down underneath the stern of the boat. And I remember John telling me they couldn't hang on any longer, and I told him, you have to. There wasn't any way I was going to be able to get up there to help him. I couldn't row or anything because we were pinned up against the underside of the ship, and he hung on, and then the surge changed and it blew us out of there, and so we were able to escape, and we got up to midship and hollered for him to move the Jacob's ladder. So we got the Jacob's ladder moved, and we climbed up, and the captain met us there, and he asked us if we were Coast Guard, and I didn't know how to really explain to him, so I just said, yeah, because kind of we are, But just to give you an idea, the wind is blowing horizontal snow and black oil, right? So black oil's getting all over everything. It was really a ugly night. So we did a survey of the ship to find out what all was okay and what wasn't, and started reporting in by the radio. And in the meantime, we had there was a whole cutter crew from the Coast Guard here in town. So you had literally, I don't know, 150, 200 Coast Guardsmen were out there, and of course you have the Marine Safety Detachment, and you had the Port Department. Everybody's out there, and so there was a decision made to get the crew off the ship, and which was wise because the guys are just all burnt out and everything. So we loaded the two deceased guys into the port lifeboat, and then we loaded the injured guy in there first, and then we lowered it down to the demarcation deck, and then we got all the rest of the crew but the captain in there and put the engineer in charge. Well, the engineer had a bad attitude, and so he was really he wasn't very cooperative, but at any rate, he was the only officer left, and so he was in charge of operating the lifeboat. And so I'm trying to explain to him, look, we got a plan here. We're going to run a line from the bow of the lifeboat to shore, and then we're going to have a line from the stern of the lifeboat, so there's no way we're going to lose control. Okay?
Yeah,
Like that?
louder.
Okay.
Louder.
Okay, so it seemed like we couldn't get in trouble, right? Well, at any rate, the idea was that we're going to have to communicate, right? Because this is the middle of the night now, right? And you can't see shore. We got a spotlight, but you can't hardly make it out through the snow and everything, what's going on the beach. All once in a while, we can see all these Coast Guard guys when the squalls go by, but other than that, we can't see it. So I'm asking the lieutenant running the safety detachment, if he could get those guys to grab this line. We're going to shoot it in with a line gun for them to get that line, and we were going to make it off to the bow of the lifeboat and have the guys just put tension on it while we slack it off. So it sounded like a good plan. So, but then they decided they wanted to hook it up to a loader. And I said, well, we don't really need a loader. And, oh, yeah, we're going to use a loader. I says, okay, well, give the loader operator a radio because I got to talk to the guy, right? Well, that was the last time I heard from anybody. And so I go out there and tell them, okay, you know, we're starting lowering the lifeboat down. Well, it starts pulling away from the hull, you know. And so I run back up, and I'm telling them, stop, stop, you know. And then I'm running back out telling the engineer, you know, don't release the falls, don't release the falls. And then I go back and say, stop pulling, right? So I go back out, and here's the lifeboat's pulled like 50 feet away from the side of the ship. And this big wave comes wrapping around, and it touches the bottom of the lifeboat. So the engineer trips the falls, drops the lifeboat into the water, and then the line breaks because they're pulling on too hard. So then the lifeboat slams back into the ship and gets sucked out into the black abyss behind the ship, you know, where you got these great big 20-foot rollers coming in, right? So here now you got the lifeboat out there. It can't steer. It's got an engine, but it can't steer because you got a stern line on the doggone thing. And it's rolling clear upside down and stuff. With one guy that's got half the bones in his body broke, and the two dead fellas are falling on top of the rest of them. I mean, you can't imagine what these people are going through. And here we're trying to pull them back in with the line without getting our fingers cut off. It was the craziest thing. I could imagine things could have got goofed up so bad. But we finally got them back in there. And so then it's like, okay, the engineer, he goes and takes the lifeboat in towards the surf 3 times and turns around and comes back. He wasn't going to drive it in the surf. And I'm trying to get him to go, and he won't go. So finally he ties up, and he's not going to do nothing, right? So about this time, and every time that he drives towards the surf, here comes the Coast Guard. These guys, they got nothing but Mustang suits on, right? And they were coming right out up to their shoulders, up to their armpits in the water, in the surf. So they're getting soaking wet, you know. It's blowing 50, 60, 100 miles an hour out there in snow, and these guys are soaking wet, and scores of them are getting hypothermia. And somebody else could tell the story of what was going on with the clinic that night. But I heard the ambulance ended up running out of gas in the middle of the road out there because running back and forth to the clinic with all these coasties that were hypothermic. But at any rate, so what ends up happening is here I look and I see the harbor department's got their inflatable, right? And the coasties are carrying it, right, with the outboard motor on and everything, right out into the surf. And they launch this thing, and they drive out, and they have this mooring line with them, and they get out to the lifeboat, and they made it off and drug that sucker into shore. And we got the guys to the Grand Aleutian that night that way. Meanwhile, we went and shut down the engines and stuff to preserve the engines on the ship. But yeah, it was one of those crazy nights where you're trying to help, and man, it was lucky we didn't end up killing everybody. But
Wait a minute, the propeller was still spinning while you guys were getting...
no, it wasn't spinning anymore. It's just that, you know, there was a maelstrom of water going down through it, and so it wouldn't have been a good place to go. But yeah, so yeah, and then there's a number of stories involved in that particular project, but that first night was really, really, really crazy. And everybody, once again, though, really pitched in, but we didn't have enough control of what was going on shore, and so it almost ended up being worse than it was. But at any rate, that particular one brings to mind another one. I wonder, is there any Marine pilots? Oh, good, we can roast Marine pilots too. Okay, so that reminds me of another one. Okay, so let's see, what was the name of this one? The one that went aground on Rocky Point. Does anybody remember that one? What was the name of was it Hekafu? Maybe it was Hekafu. I think it was another tramper, and they got the pilot on board, right? And they're going to move because it was blowing out of the valley out here like crazy. Another one of those really big storms, like the one that blew over the APL container crane, you know. So we had one of those big blows coming out of the valley, and so they got to get the ship out of there. Well, they didn't get out of there soon enough, and it ends up going on that reef that's right off of Rocky Point, and that was at like 5 in the afternoon. And it was blowing so hard that my brother Dave and I, we went out on the end of the what's now the Delta Western Fuel Dock, and we're looking at Rocky Point, which is just right there, you know, and you cannot see more than 200 yards. We couldn't see the ship from the fuel dock on Rocky Point because the snow was blowing so bad. So at any rate, we get the Redeemer, run out there, and the Redeemer, it didn't have much horsepower, you know, 1,550 horsepower. So horsepower-wise, it's like the smallest tug in town, right? But because of our anchor system, we can anchor up and get into shallow water better than the regular big tugboats can, you know, especially the guys with these tractor tugs and stuff. They hate rocks, you know. And so, at any rate, so we went out there, and when we dropped our anchors the first time, it was so hard to hold a heading because of these gusts of wind. And then the first time we got our anchors down, we blew in so far, by the time we got stopped, that we were in over the shoal ourselves, and we had to pull ourselves back out again and reset the anchor. Well, basically, you know, our patient's in cardiac arrest, right? I mean, later, when we got the ship off the beach, there was 5-foot deep dents in the lube oil sump tank, okay? And for those of you that don't know ships very good, the lube oil sump tank is the oil pan of a ship, but it's also an integral part of the hull, okay? It was the lube oil sump tank that ruptured that flooded the engine room on the Swallow out at Elacta Head, okay? Once the engine room goes, you're done, okay? And so you're not going anywhere, and so then the boat sits there in the weather, and then your fuel tanks break up, and everything gets bad. And so they had 5-foot deep dents in the engine room, in the bottom of the engine room, and they were fixing to lose the engine room. And so we were, like I say, our patient was in cardiac arrest, and we were in a hurry to do something. So the next time we went to drop our 2 bow anchors, Teddy Shrebnikov was out running the anchor with us, as he usually did. And so as he's about to drop the anchors, a gust of wind hit us, and he signals with crossed arms to my brother Dave that the anchors are going to cross if he drops them. Well, Dave signals, he don't care, drop them. I don't care if you cross them, just drop them. So Ted dropped them, and so when this time we got stopped in the right position. We fired the line gun in, got the big 4-inch diameter floating tow line in there, made our hookup, and then winched ourselves out, and then we had the James Dunlap come alongside for the horsepower, right, to do the job, right? Well, so they get up, made up alongside, so we get the, and then we get the, let's see, it was one of the little yellow tugs, the Lowell S maybe, or the Padilla, I think it was the Lowell S. Anyways, we had, that was being used as the pilot boat. Well, we got that tug on our starboard side, and we're going to use it to hold our heading so that we can pull without having the wind blow us off, right? Well, the pilot, he wanted the boat over there, and we were saying, well, look, it's important that we hold our heading, and so we need the boat here. And so then the skipper on the Dunlap says, well, you don't need to worry about holding the heading. He says, this is a tractor tug. And so that didn't help. And so then I told the pilot, I says, look, you know, just let us keep this tug here until we get you pulled free, and then you can have it, right? Okay. And my brother Dave, he's mad that I'm even compromising, you know what I mean? And because it's so obvious that we need it, right? Well, anyway, so we just start taking up. I mean, we're not even pulling hard, right? But all of a sudden the wind died off, right? And so when the wind died off, so our 2 vessels start pulling forwards, and that ship just slid off the rock pile it was on, although it was still way up on the shoal, but it slid off the rock pile. The pilot on board feels his ship come free and goes, I want my pilot boat back. And so the Lowell S, oh yeah, sure, they throw the line off, away they go, right? And so then here comes the next big gust of wind, right? So now we get another 100-knot gust of wind comes, and so we start swinging to starboard, you know. And so my brother Dave calls James Dunlap and says, yeah, hey, we're 10 degrees to starboard. And the captain on the James says, yeah, give me some port rudder. And Dave says, I'm hard to port and full ahead. And he says, and we just lost another 10 degrees. And then it was like you couldn't imagine how fast that tugboat threw his lines off us. Because see, now what had happened is we were caught locked in irons because we're over so far to the wind that there's no way we're not going to get blown aground, right? Because we're just going to pivot on our tow line and we're going to wreck over there by APL, right? And so the James doesn't want to wreck with us, and so they can't hardly get their lines cut off fast enough to get away, right? And so in the meantime, old Teddy, he's been diligently up there looking at, because we had to pull the anchors, right? So he's got the anchors, and of course they're crossed under the bow. So he's been studying this mess, right, the whole time, thinking, now, if I had to drop the anchors, which one could I drop, and maybe they would come free, right? And so anyways, he's studied that, and so then it's like, okay, now it's all of a sudden it's a panic, you know? I mean, we're all going to wreck if we don't get the anchors down. And so he drops his, I think it was the starboard one, he drops first, and it came undone. And then he dropped the port one, so we had both anchors down. And of course, we drug them for a while, and they came to a stop. Well, when they stopped, we got seaweed all around us. We'd gone so far, we're clear over there, close to the APL dock now, on the end of our tow line, and we're right up into that end of the reef over there, where the, you know, on the it'd be the north side of their facility up there where the reef starts. So anyway. So now all of a sudden the little tug realizes that, oh, well, we're all in trouble, and so they're going to come rescue us, right? Well, they're at the pilot station there on the port side of the ship, on the leeward side of the ship over there, and so now the tow line's all parallel with shore, so they can't go around. They got to go. So now they're coming right through the kelp patch, headed towards us full speed, and they almost made it. They got it within about 200 feet of us or so, and they hit a rock so hard that it knocked all their governors off. All the engines in the boat died. Mains, generators, everything. So we had to shoot a line to them. We got a line, then we got a tie-up line to them, right? And so then the wind blew them right behind us, and we just winched them right up to our stern, and they eventually got everything running again and decided they'd had enough fun for the day. And so then they took off, and then the Saratoga come out and said they were willing to help, but they weren't going to put a line on us. And so, at any rate, so then eventually we got everything taken care of.
Hey, the great Dan Magone. Let's give it up for him. Hey, guys.